The voluntary carbon market. Why is it important and what is at stake? That is what we're going to explore in today's episode of Climate Mundial's Energy and Climate Weekly. So let's get right into it. The voluntary carbon market holds great promise for those aspiring to the twin aims of scaling up climate action and pursuing sustainable development. If you're watching this video, it's probably because you're interested in precisely that. The idea that individuals, firms, and other organizations wish to voluntarily commit to climate action is an entirely agreeable notion. However, the voluntary carbon market is frequently criticized, in particular with the practice of offsetting greenhouse gas emissions. Participants in the market are regularly needing to defend themselves against claims of greenwashing. At least partly in response, industry-led initiatives have emerged with the view to establishing best practice and with the promise that those who follow the guidelines avoid the perils of greenwashing. In today's episode, we're going to do a non-exhaustive exploration of the cases both for and against the voluntary carbon market. In doing so, this video will explore why this is important and also what is at stake. But first of all, let's now take a look at the case for the voluntary carbon market. Similar to international emissions trading, voluntary trade in carbon is not zero-sum. If you have two parties and one agrees to buy an item and another one agrees to sell it, provided the transaction is voluntary, each party adheres to its contractual obligations and there is no harm caused to third parties by the trade, everyone is better off as a result. If they were not, there would be no good reason to enter the trade in the first place. Therefore, if there is an individual or a firm that has no other legal or regulatory obligation to pay for emission reductions but is willing to do so, and there is another entity that's in a position to sell emission reduction certificates, then it ought to increase the amount of climate action that's taking place. So the point to be made here is that the voluntary carbon market, provided, and this is a big caveat, that these conditions are met, leads to a social benefit in the form of reduced global emissions. Payment for emission reductions means that valid projects, and we'll spend more time on this in a moment, that can deliver those reductions gain access to a new cash flow. If one follows the logic all the way through, it is access to that cash flow that makes the difference between the project going ahead or plans being filed and written off. Projects could be anything from a new forest plantation to a reduction in waste that would otherwise be sent to landfill. In principle, so long as the project is verified as being additional to business as usual, that is, would not have otherwise happened had it not been for the incentive coming from the voluntary carbon market, then it should not matter whether the project avoids a ton of greenhouse gas emissions, called avoidance, or it takes a ton of greenhouse gas out of the atmosphere, being removal. Provided the additionality threshold is met, there is no difference between avoidance and removals from a climate perspective. So the next point is that the voluntary carbon market, if the standards do what they say, releases funds for sustainable development projects that manifest as an opportunity for those projects to earn revenue. The voluntary carbon market over the years has also served as an incubator for technical innovation that can then be rolled out in compliance markets. And a very good example of this is the development of project methodologies. The first use of a methodology for projects involving the distribution of clean cooking equipment to villages in developing countries, entirely funded through the carbon market, was originally developed for the voluntary market during the 2000s decade. Eventually, the methodology was adopted by the Clean Development Mechanism, which was at the time the main compliance carbon market certification system, which was the first of what became many successful projects of this kind that was registered in 2010. Finally, the voluntary carbon market has provided a place for firms to engage in emission reduction activities ahead of the arrival of compliance markets in countries and states where those firms operate. An important example was seen in the United States state of California, where firms engaged in voluntary markets before compliance emissions trading was eventually legislated. Another is that of airlines in advance of the compliance emissions trading market developed for intercontinental aviation, known as corsia. Additionally, firms engaged in the voluntary carbon markets learned more about how efforts could be used to differentiate product offerings based on environmental attributes and to create competitive advantages in market segments where those attributes were important to customers. This has led to a capacity building and competitiveness benefit within existing firms, and also led to opportunities to create new businesses dedicated to reducing emissions. But this rounds out our arguments in favour. What do you think of them? Are there any others that should be in there? Please let me know in the comments section below. Now, let's go on to consider the case against the voluntary carbon market. Firms that use the voluntary carbon market activities to differentiate product offerings to customers have found themselves being the subject of criticism for greenwashing. This is a particularly sensitive topic when production of the underlying products and services actually emit greenhouse gases themselves, and the voluntary carbon credits or offsets are then used to market climate neutral product attributes. Some observers feel, most likely on the basis of moral grounds, that this is unacceptable, and those firms would be best focused on decarbonisation of their actual production rather than marketing the carbon neutrality of their output. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat itself decided to wind down its flagship Climate Neutral Now initiative on the basis of advice that the program is, quote, not aligned with net zero recommendations, end quote. In other words, offsetting emissions voluntarily was found to be inconsistent with the broader goal of decarbonisation and net zero emissions by 2050 that is a feature of the Paris Agreement on climate change. This does not mean to say that governments of the world have already designed and implemented policies that are guaranteed to glide the world towards net zero emissions. In fact, to the contrary, the current situation in the world is anything but at that stage. And a lot of policy and regulatory work remains necessary. Regardless, it is the perceived contradiction between net zero goals and the fact voluntary offsetting may delay efforts to decarbonise that generates controversy. It is the possibility of being involved in controversy that drives some, though not all firms, away from the voluntary carbon market. The voluntary carbon markets have become increasingly focused on qualitative attributes, with buyers having preferences for credits coming from specific projects, arising from specific methodologies, based in specific countries, and certified using specific certification schemes. While this is absolutely correctly down to the choice of the purchasing entity to specify, it means that voluntary carbon market credits are not particularly fungible. That is, they cannot be exchanged in the market without limitation. These qualitative preferences mean that it is difficult, if not impossible, for liquid secondary markets for those credits to develop. Futures markets, which would allow buyers and sellers to agree prices for credits to be delivered at specified future dates with market standard terms and conditions, simply cannot create contracts for every qualitative variety of credit there is on the market. By consequence, this means that price discovery is a real challenge. Investors into projects find it difficult to raise finance because the future value of credits is highly uncertain. Furthermore, markets are averse to purchasing credits with longer dated vintages, that is, credits where the emission reductions were produced a long way in the past. While this is done to match the emission reductions more closely with the emissions being offset, it removes an important incentive to invest in a project. This is the incentive to reduce emissions today on the expectation that In future, emission reductions will become more scarce, and by consequence, the certificates will become more valuable. It's very difficult to imagine a world in which voluntary action to produce, buy and sell emission reduction certificates by firms and individuals does not continue, at least in a world where countries get close to achieving the net zero emissions goals by 2050 under the Paris Agreement. After all, the term used is net and not absolute zero emissions. This implies that there may still be some emissions, but removals will compensate for them. However, for the voluntary carbon market to reach its full potential, it needs to overcome, as a bare minimum, some of the issues raised here in this video in the arguments against. To achieve this, it will require market participants working with governments while also obtaining engagement from external stakeholders who make criticisms of the market. As stated earlier, the voluntary carbon market holds great promise for those aspiring to the twin aims of scaling up climate action and also pursuing sustainable development. The idea that individuals, firms and other organisations wish to voluntarily commit to climate action is entirely agreeable. The voluntary carbon market could make an important contribution to reaching net zero by 2050, though that is not likely to happen by accident. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode of Climate Mundial's Energy and Climate Weekly. So bye for now.